As I said before, I'll be going over some of the terminologies regarding the Overlord series first before I do my usual character breakdown videos. And to continue with the series, in today's video I'll be taking a look at the background and world of the game Yggdrasil that Momonga was playing before he was transported to the new world. As usual, there will be spoilers for the Overlord series, so here's a spoiler warning just in case. Also, if you enjoyed the video, why not give it a like and maybe subscribe to the channel for more breakdowns like this in the future. To start, what is a DMMORPG? So it stands for Dive Massively Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Game, and they are games that exist in the world of 2138. And to access this type of games, people were required to connect a proprietary console to their own brain, then using a neural nano interface which allows the human brain to function as a supercomputer and allow people to enter the virtual world and experience it as though it was real life. A bit similar to what Elon Musk is promising to do with his Neuralink project. Also, to avoid the misuse of the technology, numerous restrictions were made, and they were especially strict when it came to DMMORPGs. They had to remove things like the sense of smell, taste and touch to avoid people from becoming confused with the virtual world and the real world. DMMORPGs also restricted adult-related behaviors as well to prevent players from physically harassing or abusing other players. That's why most DMMORPGs also heavily monitored players to prevent any violations, and offenders were often punished by having their accounts deleted. This was actually one of the reasons how Momonga could tell that he was no longer in the game of Yggdrasil, because he was able to fondle Albedo's breast without any repercussions. Now, for the game itself, it was a DMMORPG developed in Japan in the year 2126, and when it first started, it managed to get so popular that at one point, the word DMMORPG was practically synonymous with Yggdrasil. However, after 12 years of service, it lost most of its player base, and during the final moments of the game, only a few players had stayed behind like Momonga did at the start of the anime. Now, Yggdrasil was considered a game of exploration, and many things about the game were intentionally left unknown for players to investigate and discover on their own. It certainly didn't help that the only good piece of information ever released by the developers were basically the controls of the game or miscellaneous functions like chatting, calling the GM or logging out and so on. Everything else was just a free-for-all, and even the basic items that one is able to use or not use had to be tested out through repeated trial and error. Because Yggdrasil was the type of game where information itself was valuable and new information became a highly sought-after commodity, most of the items, locations, skills and classes discovered by players were never intentionally shared to the public to avoid giving other players the advantage. Of course, there was also no merit in sharing information with strangers unless it came at a price, especially when it came to game-breaking things like the World Items. However, despite the practice of sharing information being few and far between, there was still a lot of public information collected on the game itself, and it was estimated that throughout the game service, only about 30% of the 9 worlds had been mapped. Granted, there could still be some information not shared with the public, and just shows how large the game actually is. Although during the final years of Yggdrasil, when many players had quit the game, a lot more reliable and hidden information were eventually released to the public. As you can probably guess from the title of the game, Yggdrasil is a reference to the World Tree found in Norse mythology. It's depicted as a great ash tree located at the center of the universe, which acts as a bridge to the 9 realms. The backstory for the game goes like this. The World Tree was once large and beautiful, but one day a giant monster had appeared and it started to consume all the leaves until only 9 were left. These 9 leaves will make up the 9 realms, which are called Asgard, Elfheim, Vanaheim, Nidavellir, Midgard, Jotunheim, Niflheim, Helheim, and Muspelheim respectively, while the other leaves that were not eaten scattered throughout the realms, and they will become the World Items. If you're interested on the World Items, I already did a video going over them, and I'll leave a link in the top right corner, so be sure to check it out. Anyway, in the game you are allowed to freely travel through the 9 realms, and the worlds were so massive that they were estimated to have been 2 to 3 times the size of Tokyo. And as you travel further out from the center of the world, the difficulty would greatly increase, having higher level enemies, terrains and landscapes that have special effects or conditions that require special equipment just to be able to travel through them. But not only were the worlds massive though, the designs of them were also quite intricate, with each being vastly different from the others while still staying true to their origins in Norse mythology. There were also areas that could only be found under certain conditions, and even some worlds would benefit certain races or classes. Like say you're using a zombie character in the cold dark world of Niflheim, you will most likely gain a boost or buff to your character, while a human character will probably suffer from penalties or negative conditions. Now, like most RPG games, the 9 realms of Yggdrasil were filled with various types of dungeons as well that players can use to grind levels or farm for materials and items. But because the dungeons vary in design and size, they often contain various types of biomes like giant swamplands, dense forest areas, scorching dry deserts, and the list goes on. And to give you an idea of how unpredictable the dungeons were, some of them needed specific conditions just to find them or specialized equipment just to traverse them. A notable example of this is the frozen city in Niflheim, which can only be entered during a blizzard, and obviously you need winter gear to at least have a chance. Size and layout aside, the difficulty for dungeons also varied, and because of the lack of information given to players by the developers, just trying to take on a dungeon without any proper preparations were likely to always spell the death for most players. That's why working in parties is a good way to make dungeon clearing easier, but the idea of sharing the loot with others might not be too appealing for everyone. This is also because players or parties that were the first to clear any dungeon would receive a 10% bonus for treasures and 10 to 20% when it comes to high level equipment spawn. There were even cases where players would receive world items if they managed to clear a dungeon under certain conditions, like how the Guild 1 Ugang received the Throne of Kings after they cleared the Great Tomb of Nazarick on their first try. But anyways, about 40% of the difficulties within the dungeon were mostly made up of fighting monsters and traversing environmental hazards, while the remaining 60% were players trying to defeat the dungeon bosses. And for the monsters of Yggdrasil, they are pretty much the typical ones that you will find in most fantasy games like zombies, ogres, goblins, demons, and many more. They spawn throughout the dungeon and they are programmed with the same rules for the player creation, so many of their basic stats, skills, and abilities were quite similar. Bosses on the other hand came with some alterations like their abilities, appearances, and spawn areas, and like I said, they made up 60% of the difficulty, but it wasn't that hard to defeat one because it mostly comes down to how much information can be gathered and the preparation done by the players. However, there were some bosses that were so insanely difficult that even with a solid strategy and proper preparations, you might not be able to defeat them. They were called world enemies, hidden bosses with powers on a level that is comparable to the world items, and defeating them was certainly not an easy task, but the rewards for beating them would definitely make it worth it, like getting a world item. And to give you an idea of how powerful they are, they could nullify all the resistances of players or NPCs, and they are able to take on even a legion-sized party which consisted of 36 players. Furthermore, they couldn't even be affected by world items, and it was said that in the past, the Guild 1 Ugang was almost destroyed as a result of fighting a world enemy. Having said that, there are a total of 32 level-breaking bosses in the game, and their names like the 5 Rainbow Buddhas, the Lords of the 7 Deadly Sins, the 10 Archangels of the SEPHIRA, and those were just some of them. But in any case, when it came to fighting monsters and bosses, Yggdrasil has an aggro system in place that causes monsters to focus on certain targets based on a set of criteria. This was expressed as a numerical value called hate, and depending on the amount of damage dealt, healing done, types of buffs or debuffs, and skills used by players, their hate will increase, causing the monsters to target them. But when a player is hit by a monster, your hate value would decrease, and the aggro would then switch to another player with higher hate value. That's why tanks had to pay attention to the monster's hate value during combat, and luckily the hate value would always be displayed, so it was easy to keep track of. Now, the last feature that I wanted to mention were the guild-based dungeons. They are dungeons that if a guild successfully clear and conquer, they will be granted ownership of said dungeon, and they had the option of turning it into their home base, with the Great Tomb of Nazarick being a good example of one. However, guilds were only allowed to possess one guild-based dungeon at a time, so if they wanted to claim another better one, they would need to first relinquish ownership over their present one. But aside from that, guild-based dungeons also came with levels embedded into them, which can be used by players to create custom NPCs for defending their base. And to give you an example of what I mean, let's say you have 1000 levels of NPC data storage, which technically meant that you can divide up the 1000 levels to create a total of 10 level 100 custom NPCs or any combination of that. Also, the custom NPCs apparently are programmed to only stay in the guild base and can never leave, but it seems like when Nazarick was transported to the new world, this restriction was no more. That said, higher risk dungeons offered more levels of NPC data storage, and the limit can be further increased by paying for it or through special conditions. For example, the Great Tomb of Nazarick initially only had 2250 levels, but when the Guild 1 Ugang managed to conquer the dungeon in their first try, they were granted an additional 500 levels. But for the highest possible value of NPC data storage that a dungeon would have, it was 3000 levels, and you can only find one dungeon per round to come with this value, and they were insanely hard to clear. Additionally, keeping a guild-based dungeon can become quite costly depending on the size because of the money needed to keep a base running, like the creation of NPCs if you have a lot, or maintaining the defenses of a large base itself. That's why the best way to cripple a guild is to simply raid their base constantly until they become bankrupt, because even reactivating traps, repairing damages, and the revival of NPCs requires some serious money, especially when it came to large guild-based dungeons. But then again, larger guild-based dungeons do have some benefits like automatically spawning NPCs or monsters that doesn't incur any financial costs, so they can still save and recover some money with that, but the downside is that they are weaker than custom NPCs.
こちらをご覧ください。
Anyways, that was some of the information on the game Yggdrasil and its world, and there's still so many things I haven't talked about, like the different racial and job classes, the magic system, and the customization of the game itself, but I'll leave those topics for a future video. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if I missed anything, feel free to let me know in the comments down below, and also any suggestions that you might have. If you want more Overlord content like this, be sure to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay safe everyone.